Okay, so now I'm finally looking at Frederick the Great's Life of War by a YouTuber known as House of History, who, as far as I can remember, we haven't seen a video produced by this person, so this is very much a first time for me. And yeah, overall, this video is way too long. It is 7 hours, 8 minutes, and 49 seconds. I was originally going to try to break it up into individual parts like I usually do, but then we'd be here for like 30, maybe like 30 episodes, and I couldn't really find a successful way to break it up. So I just decided for this series, I'm just gonna make it 7 parts and watch an hour and 8 minutes each. We'll see how it goes, but that's how I'm gonna approach this. So yeah. Overall though, I am actually really looking forward because obviously I've heard of Frederick the Great, but I've never like looked too deep into him other than he is a great military commander. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what old Freddy boy can show me and what he's made of. So yeah, this video ain't gonna watch itself, so we should probably get to it, eh? Without any further ado, let's get to Frederick the Great's Life of War by the House of History.
It was a cold and misty morning on April 10, 1741. The 28-year-old Prussian King Frederick II looked at the small town of Mollwitz in the province of Silesia. Together with his near 22,000-strong army, he managed to use the cover of darkness and fog to creep up on the Habsburg forces quartering nearby. Judging by the campfires and the lack of movement, they had no idea a larger force was moving in on them. Frederick ordered his soldiers to take up positions and take their battle lines. His right-hand man, the experienced Prussian general Kurt von Schwerin, warned Frederick. If he deployed his army in a battle line, the element of surprise would be long gone. Frederick did not heed his warning, despite repeated pleas from his officers. Many years later, when reflecting on this battle, Frederick conceded he should have listened to them. It would be a costly mistake, but alas, the Battle of Mollwitz, Frederick the Great's baptism of fire, was about to commence. Ever since the Treaty of Westphalia concluding the 30 Years' War in 1648, the Holy Roman Empire had been a shadow of its former self. It was a patchwork of states, dominions, and duchies, with German princes attempting to seize as much power as possible. Over the years, the two ancient European powers, Austria and France, were joined by Britain and Russia, with Poland, Spain, and the Ottoman Empire in decline. Holland and Sweden were unable to maintain themselves among the European giants. In October 1740, the Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI died without a male heir. Before his death, he had issued the Pragmatic Sanction. This meant so much as that the Habsburg hereditary territories were allowed to pass to a woman, his daughter, Maria Theresa. Yet, internal strife in Austria led to a weak and divided empire.
Yeah, like I said, I'm kind of glad we watched the, old Britannia videos, because Maria kind of inherited such a crap situation, and, I still really admire her for holding it down and still managing to pull Austria through, because like I said, she came into power in such a bad situation. It was nice her dad pulled strings to allow a woman to gain control, but also he kind of gave her, like I said, left her with a pretty bad, just Austria was in a really bad position at this point in history, and she had to like help clean it up.
Austria had just participated in the War of the Polish Succession and concluded a poor peace with the Ottomans. But it wasn't just the Austrian Habsburgs who were in an unstable position. For example, in Russia, Tsarina Anna passed away, and factions at court fought over control as her infant son, Ivan VI, succeeded her. The British were preoccupied with the war against Spain, and France was eager to weaken its archrival, the Habsburgs. As soon as Maria Theresa ascended to the throne, several European monarchs broke their promise of recognizing her. Meanwhile, within the turbulent European theatre, one young king did not plan to play by the rules. In May 1740, King of Prussia Frederick William I passed away. Known as the Soldier King, he spent his entire reign expanding his army, dedicating the crown's revenue to drilling and improving his force. When he died, his 27-year-old son Frederick II succeeded him. He inherited a well-disciplined, modern, and relatively massive army, including a comfortably stocked war chest. Their healthy finances contrasted Prussia with the less-than-ideal finances of the electorates of Bavaria and Saxony. Their subsequent rulers spent heavily on palaces, ceremonies, and securing titles. Saxony's Elector Augustus III doubled as Poland's king and Lithuania's Grand Duke. Meanwhile, despite the electorate's troubled finances, Bavaria's Elector Charles Albert contested Maria Theresa's husband Francis of Lorraine's claim as the Holy Roman Emperor. Being an elector, and thus being able to cast an imperial vote, Frederick figured he shouldn't trade his vote for free. To make sure he played both sides, he assured Bavaria's elector that he supported his claim to the throne, albeit covertly, so he could also bargain with Maria Theresa if she turned out to have the upper hand. As such, the young king seeking to prove himself found himself in an incredibly favorable position. The geopolitical balance in Europe was quite uncertain, with all major powers preoccupied with other problems. So when Frederick learned...
Alright, cool. I love seeing the political maneuvering of Frederick. Obviously, there's gonna be a heavy emphasis on just on battle, and that's mainly what he's known for. But we do love to see, the intelligence of great leaders outside of the battlefield and how they can just maneuver this really turbulent time, because Prussia at this point isn't a great power. I think it isn't until they take some territory here from the Habsburgs, Austria. So for now, Frederick's just biding his time. And yeah, he's got a pretty cool army left over from his dad, I wish my dad had left me like a great army like Alexander's did and Frederick. I didn't get crap from my dad when he bailed. But either way, overall, and it's cool to see Poland here. Like I said, like usually when we cover around this era of history, Poland's usually just not a non-factor, so it's just kind of cool to see it still exist. So yeah.
Of Bavaria lodging claims to the Habsburg inheritance, and the Saxons following suit, he knew he had to act fast if he wanted to enter history books. And if we believe Frederick's writings, his motive indeed was that simple. In his own words, the satisfaction of having my name in the journals and later in history seduced me. A logical target would be Silesia, yielding the most tax from Habsburg lands. Moreover, it was one of the most industrialized areas at the time. Using the infrastructure his father left him, he mobilized his entire army much faster than any other European state could. To sketch a timeline, in October, Frederick learned of the emperor's death, and by December 16, his armies crossed the Silesian border.
Wow.
It was an unprovoked and unexpected attack of a minor player against the leading dynasty of the Holy Roman Empire and great power. There were barely any Habsburg troops stationed there, 4,000 at best. By January 17, the entire province was his, except for a few fortresses, among them Brieg and Neisse. All the while, Frederick engaged in active and energetic diplomacy with the ministers at home, European courts, and even with Vienna. Upon hearing of Frederick's...
Yeah, again, like, another aspect is just the desire for glory. Frederick's young, like, he's barely, like, in his late 20s, so he's young, and he has an army, and just, like, yeah, the desire for glory is there, which is a huge part of many great people in history. And yeah, again, another great aspect that we're already seeing off the bat is just his speed and how quickly he moved and how he's using the army that he has. And it really is like a big, yeah, very much is a very big power move that like a minor power at this point just took something from, like I said, one of the, I suppose, great powers at the time, the Austria-Hungary Habsburg dynasty. Like, it really is, he does come across like, yeah, that as an upstart, but he proves, as we know in history, he proves to back it all up.
This callous invasion, the entire Habsburg court responded with shock, horror, and anger. Maria Theresa sent an army numbering approximately 20,000 under Wilhelm Reinhard von Nijper to retake Silesia via Moravia. There was nothing but contempt for Frederick's obscene actions. Nijper caught the inexperienced Frederick sleeping. Rapidly advancing via the west, he relieved the besieged fortresses of Neisse, marching onto Breslau. Nijperk's positioning cut Frederick off from the kingdom, headquarters, and supply lines. Frederick now had to hurry back to prevent Nijperk from cementing his position. A race between both armies emerged, trying to reach the other first. Frederick received valuable intelligence, however. Several captured Austrian soldiers revealed Nijperk's position nearby the village of Mollwitz. Thanks to the fog and slight drizzle, Frederick's army could close in on Nijperk's camp without them noticing. What followed was one of the most evident signs of Frederick's inexperience. Instead of using the element of surprise, he took his merry time deploying his army in a battle line, doing everything by the book. Additionally, he miscalculated the distance of a river close by, deploying several units behind a bend and others at a 90-degree angle from his main battle line. While all this was going on, Nijperk pulled on. His soldiers were cooking food and mainly facing the wrong direction. They were spread over the villages of Mollwitz and Grüningen. Panicked, he deployed his entire army. Thanks to having their guard down, this took over an hour. And thanks to Frederick taking his time, he allowed his enemy to position themselves in a proper battle line. Regarding the army composition, the Prussians enjoyed multiple
Yeah, so I'll say, like, obviously Frederick, this is like his first time, it seems, like, you know, being in charge. And overall, yeah, inexperience is, like I said, beyond forgivable. This is like his first foray into, like, you know, like being a general. Well, I'm sure he must have had, I don't know, the point is, seems like where he's the main dog, if as you were, and, you know, obviously he's already made some big errors, such as underestimating how fast the frickin' Austrians retaliated, probably not being caught unawares with that, and now ruining the element of surprise to straight up just form a pitched battle line instead of, you know, again, he didn't utilize his element of surprise, which could have probably given him a pretty quick and decisive victory. Instead, now he's reduced it to just a pitched battle, it seems.
advantages. The Austrians commanded some 19,000 troops, whereas the Prussians fielded 21,600 men. Furthermore, they utilized an iron ramrod, a novel way to increase the firing frequency of their flintlock muskets. As a result, the Prussian infantry fired up to 3 times more rapid than the Austrians. In addition, Frederick's late father drilled the Prussians, making them renowned for their discipline. In contrast, many of the Austrians were recently levied recruits. Frederick's infantry and artillery outnumbered the Austrians. However, the Austrian cavalry outnumbered the Prussians 2-1. The Austrians positioned their army in one long line with cavalry on its flanks. Meanwhile, Frederick himself manned the right flank of his army, consisting of a mixed cavalry-infantry contingent. The 2 center lines consisted of the Prussian infantry. On the left stood the heavily outnumbered Prussian cavalry. At around 2 p.m., Frederick ordered his artillery to open fire and his 2 center lines to advance onto the enemy positions. This was Frederick's first serious experience of battle. Several shells impacted the Austrian left flank, where up to 5,000 horsemen were stationed. Understanding they were under fire, they took the initiative, and without waiting for orders, they decided to launch a charge against the Prussian cavalry. The latter didn't attempt to counter the charge, despite a numerically superior Austrian force now charging them head-on. When both parties collided, the damage inflicted on the Prussians was significant. It didn't matter, Frederick was among them. Many of the Prussians devolved into a rout. Eyewitness accounts describe Frederick to behave with incredible courage, more than once risking his life with near indifference, but it didn't change a thing. With the Prussian cavalry crumbling and fleeing, the right flank of the center infantry lines was now exposed. Part of the Austrian cavalry charged into them. The situation appeared.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, okay. So that's one of the few times we see where soldiers just took the initiative and proceeded to cause damage. Granted, they were outnumbered, but probably not trying to stop the cavalry charge sooner was probably a big problem, because, yeah, like I said, the center infantry is advancing, so, like, if you don't move, eventually the cavalry, like this situation right here, so probably that was it seems to be like a pretty big mistake of not trying to stop them sooner or counter quicker on Frederick's part. And it's cool to see such inexperience, like even the greats started somewhere, right? And no one's perfect, especially off the bat. So yeah, overall, it'll be cool to see Frederick kind of grow into his greatness.
Rather grim, if not hopeless, for the Prussians. The battle had only just begun and they lost control of the battlefield entirely. General Kurt Christoph Graf von Schwerin urged Frederick to leave. The king, appreciating his less than favorable situation, heeded this warning. He fled to the east with his cavalry unit, nearly being caught in the process. With Frederick gone, Schwerin, a veteran general, took over command. No matter his experience, Schwerin had a rather daunting task cut out for him. By now, the Prussian cavalry was entirely scattered and the Austrian cavalry was making serious inroads against the Prussian infantry, launching constant charges against them. There were no rare instances of friendly fire from the second line against the first line either, but the Prussian infantry held firm. They continued firing volleys against and engaging in close combat with the Austrian cavalry. They killed their commander and caused significant casualties. When the Austrian infantry regiments tried to join the fight and relieve pressure from the cavalry, they suffered the brunt of the Prussian lines firing volleys at an incredible pace. After a while, the Prussian infantry finally managed to fend off the Austrian cavalry. Subsequently, Schwerin ordered the surviving infantrymen to loot the ammunition from the slain soldiers. He concentrated the majority of the Prussian infantry on his right flank. Then he ordered the right flank forward. The left flank received the same order shortly after. The Prussian bulwark advanced, stopping in between the marching, only to fire at the enemy. They swiftly repelled a hesitant charge by the Austrian right flank cavalry. An Austrian survivor recounted the moment. The enemy army now advanced from...
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. Count, how do you pronounce that? Schwerin? I just use Google Translate right now. They said Schwerin. Point is, it's kind of cool how Schwerin essentially, Frederick seems to, so far, his army, which was on the brink of almost total collapse, is being saved. Definitely relying on, the more experienced quality of his, underlings here with Schwerin taking the reins and kind of helping almost reverse the misfortune that fell upon them right at the beginning.
All sides, they enjoyed a numerical superiority of up to 3,000 men. They overlapped us on both flanks. I can safely say that never in my life did I see anything finer. They marched forward with the greatest steadiness, with their lines as straight as a die, as if they were on the parade ground. Their polished weapons glinting in the sunlight made a stunning impression, and their volleys were like a constant roll of thunder. Our army became completely demoralized, our infantry could no longer be kept together in their ranks, and our cavalry no longer had any wish to form up against the enemy. The Prussian right flank was the first to reach the Austrians. Besides firing, the front lines engaged in heavy close combat. Brutal fighting spread along the entire Austrian line. This went on for a time as the Prussian left joined in soon after. The Austrian left was the first to break. As they saw their fellow soldiers flee the battlefield, the other soldiers too broke rank and abandoned the battlefield. Nyperk understood they were losing momentum. It would be challenging, if not impossible, to emerge from this situation victoriously. By the late afternoon, Nyperk ordered the official retreat.
Wow.
Lacking cavalry, and because the night set in, the Prussians decided not to pursue the Austrians. Instead, Schwerin sent a messenger to Frederick to notify him of the victory.
Yeah, I have to say, Schwerin essentially captured victory from the jaws of defeat. That was incredibly, just kind of really cool to witness. He really turned it around, which I think helped show his experience and just, the quality of the Prussian war machine at this point. That was actually really impressive. That for a second there, I thought that was a total defeat, but nope.
The Austrians retreated to Neisse, and the Prussians laid siege to Brieg, and they captured it on May 4th. Frederick made several mistakes during the battle, which he agreed to in a self-critical battle account. Despite this, letters he sent to his ministers and close relatives in the direct aftermath omit Schwerin's role in the battle entirely. His leaving of the battlefield could have multiple reasons. The most straightforward conclusion to draw was that Frederick fled, although many primary sources and subsequent historical analysis agree he showed great courage during the battle itself. He likely left upon repeated pleas by General Schwerin. But in any event, the new Prussian king managed to challenge one of Europe's greatest dynasties and emerge victoriously. In that regard, the victory at Mollwitz ensured Frederick's name traveled to all European courts. Despite not being in command himself, and the triumph largely having been achieved thanks to the discipline of his forces instilled by his father, it was a victory nonetheless. And the young king made sure he learned of his mistakes. He set up a grueling training regimen for his cavalry to never again be unprepared. He rose before dawn and drilled throughout the day. Naturally, he expected his officers and soldiers to do the exact same. Mollwitz would not be the final battle between the young king and the Habsburgs. If anything, as Thomas Carlyle put it, Mollwitz was the loose pebble precipitating an avalanche. The First Silesian War and the War of the Austrian Succession had only just broken out. On the evening of May 16, 1742, Frederick II, King of Prussia, and his 10,000-strong army set up camp somewhere in Bohemia. The men lit their campfires and began cooking, while Frederick talked strategy with his officers. Then a messenger suddenly entered his camp. His horse, out of breath, he handed Frederick a letter written by his general marching, with the remainder of his army around 1 day's march behind him. The day before, Frederick passed a minor Austrian encampment nearby the town of Chotusitz. Thinking nothing of it, he continued his march. This letter, however, revealed the encampment they passed wasn't minor. It housed a 28,000-strong Habsburg army chasing Frederick. His general urged him to turn around immediately, as there was no doubt in his mind his army would face battle at the break of dawn. After Frederick's victory at Mollwitz, news traveled fast to all European courts. The small, insignificant Prussia managed to take on one of the greatest European dynasties. And they won. In the direct aftermath, Mollwitz led to a chain of events resulting in the War of the Austrian Succession. Planning rights, a period of diplomatic activity followed. Every power participating in the subsequent war had different interests. In short, the Habsburgs wanted to reclaim Silesia. Frederick wanted international recognition for his conquest of Silesia, and especially not his fellow electorates of Saxony and Bavaria to gain anything at his expense. The interests of other powers were a bit more complex. Bavaria wanted its elector to become Holy Roman Emperor, and Saxony wanted to take whatever territories it could to link Poland-Lithuania with its electorate. France wanted to prevent Maria Theresa's husband from becoming Holy Roman Emperor, preferably while reducing the Habsburg dominions to a second-rate power. In May, Bavaria and Spain, with the support of France, signed the Treaty of Nymphenburg. The treaty agreed to support the Bavarian elector's candidacy as Holy Roman Emperor. Later, Savoy, Piedmont, and Saxony joined the alliance. Finally, Prussia joined on June 4th, with France agreeing to send 2 French army corps, one to aid Prussia, one to invade Bohemia. Still, Frederick wanted Silesia, but he knew he would not benefit if Maria Theresa's lands were improperly dismembered. As such, he joined the alliance with a significant dose of suspicion. Despite his allies preparing for war, Frederick enjoyed a relatively quiet summer welcoming reinforcements and, at best, enduring some cavalry skirmishes against Hungarian hussars. Then in August, the French army corps arrived. Contrary to Frederick's expectations, namely marching them to Vienna, a combined French, Saxon-Bavarian army focused on conquering Bohemia to secure the electoral vote for Charles of Bavaria. Frederick's allies didn't know that Frederick concluded a secret truce with General Nyberg on October 9th. The Habsburgs were in a desperate situation, losing ground every day. Frederick did not want to lose face towards his allies. As such, both parties concluded a verbal truce which stopped Prussia from making war, without appearing to have stopped making war. Within a few months, Frederick had already betrayed his alliance. And it was...
Okay. I will say, though, it is interesting just seeing how Frederick's getting involved in European, like, powers. But now he's, like, just... Again, he's all over the place in terms of, like, I don't know, I just find that super interesting. Oh, that's funny.
Would not be the last time. In November, a combined French-Bavarian-Saxon army captured Prague. 1 month later, Charles was crowned King of Bohemia. Then, securing this electoral vote, he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in January 1742. Prussia had been relatively dormant during these developments. Realizing his allies were taking control of the situation, Frederick decided breaking the truce would be worth it to cement his position. In December, he invaded Bohemia and captured Troppau and Olmütz. He betrayed Maria Theresa a second time. He rationalized it by
okay, wait, how does he rationalize it?
Stating the Austrians in fact broke the truce by leaking its existence to certain parties.
It's your fault, not mine. Yeah, at the end, I think Frederick's on Team Frederick, and, you know, it does seem like he'll do what's in best interest more towards himself, at least at the moment. And poor Austria, man. Poor Austria. But yeah, I think that's pretty telling so far. I wonder if, like, if that's gonna be like a permanent trait Frederick has, or he's gonna grow. He's young though, you know, like any faults are more of a youth thing, but I am interested in seeing more about his personality and what kind of, like, a person he is.
Though things went well for Frederick for now, his allies faced tougher challenges. In January, a fresh army levied in large part from Hungary and Croatia under Field Marshal Count Ludwig Andreas Khevenhüller was determined to drive out the Habsburg enemies. From Vienna, he marched to Linz, where he defeated the French general Ségur. They continued their march west, capturing Munich, banning riots. In a twist of irony, the Bavarian elector was crowned emperor on that day in Frankfurt am Main. The first among European sovereigns had no state, no army, and no resources. In the background, Frederick continued securing his hold on Silesia by defeating some defiant Austrian garrisons before marching into Moravia together with a 20,000-strong Saxon army. However, when they reached Brno, the Saxons refused to go any further. Their refusal was one of the many reasons Frederick referred to when publicly bad-mouthing his allies on many occasions. It would not bode well for the future.
Frederick also, like, I think from, like, the last video we saw, like, his trash talking of, you know, Maria and the Russian leader. I forgot the woman's name, but point is, he does seem like a trash talker, which is kind of funny because he seems more honest. I'm trying to gauge his personality so far from what we've seen, and so far, yeah, probably not afraid to straight up trash talk people, which I think is funny.
Constant harassment of supply and communication lines by Hungarian hussars and local irregulars led Frederick to try and squeeze the province as dry as he could before setting up his headquarters at Kudin. Facing hard times, Frederick reached out to Maria Theresa to see if she would be willing to accept another pact of neutrality. Considering his earlier violations and his callous invasion to begin with, she would not be fooled a third time.
Fool me once, shame on you, right? Yeah, it does seem like Frederick, at least so far, at this point in his life, does seem more willy-nilly in terms of just straight up breaking truces. So Maria ain't wrong to completely be like, nah, I think you're like untrustworthy. It is it is fuck. I love the audacity of you know, just like, hey, another truce, you know. Oh man.
Sources conflict whether Maria Theresa sent an army to recapture Prague or to root out Frederick specifically. At any rate, in April, Austrian troops stationed in Bohemia received orders to link up with an army advancing through Moravia, fielding an approximately 28,000 strong army under the commander Charles of Lorraine. They marched in Frederick's direction. Correspondence reveals Frederick was in the dark for the majority of the operation. It wasn't until May 10th he realized a powerful Austrian army marched in his direction. So he decided to split his army into two, taking them north. Frederick took 10,000 soldiers, while one day behind them followed 18,000 more under Leopold of Anhalt-Dessau, son of Frederick's mentor, the Old Dessauer. Frederick...
Alright, this is an interesting move. So far, the Austrians, if there's anything, like, favorable towards them, they do seem to usually catch Frederick off guard when they mobilize against him. You know, like first they caught him off guard in his previous invasion here, and now they've done it once again. Though they haven't been fully able to fully capitalize on that advantage so far, but it is something of note, I think.
And Dessau figured they traveled far in advance of the Austrians. Then on May 15, Frederick passed an Austrian encampment near the village of Chotusitz. He didn't think much of it. One day later, near Chotusitz, Dessau's rearguard engaged in a minor skirmish with Austrian cavalry. The experienced commander understood it wasn't just a random encampment or skirmish. It was, in fact, Charles's entire army. Respecting the danger he was in, Dessau ordered his men on a grueling march towards Frederick to bridge the gap. He sent out several horse riders with the urgent message for Frederick to turn around and march towards him. That night at 2 a.m. his exhausted army occupied Chotusitz, a small Bohemian village. Riders returned with Frederick's reply. Dessau was not to engage under any circumstances until Frederick arrived. Dessau commanded up to 18,000 Prussian infantry. He deployed his men to the south of Chotusitz. He positioned his cavalry on both flanks, with his left flank commanded by Lieutenant General von Walldorf. In front of the Zirkwitz pond on his far right stood 70-year-old Lieutenant General von Buddenbrock. The cavalry consisted of heavy cuirassiers, dragoons and light hussars. The positioning was done on purpose so that once Frederick arrived, he would find room to deploy his infantry. The infantry was comprised of both grenadiers and light infantry. Charles wanted to mount a charge before Frederick could deploy his army. Before dawn, he already deployed his infantry in two long lines in the center, flanked by two sizable cavalry contingents. The Austrian infantry wore the characteristic white coats with lapels, a tricorn hat equipped with muskets, bayonets, and small swords. The Austrian cavalry consisted of Hungarian hussars and traditional heavy Austrian cavalry. The left was commanded by General Karl Baczany, and the right by Wenzel, Prince of Liechtenstein. Before 7 a.m., Charles ordered his infantry lines to begin their march forward. Frederick and his 10,000 soldiers arrived around 7 a.m. A large body of Austrian soldiers advancing in the distance welcomed him. The Austrian artillery fired away at the Prussian positions, but the Austrians had no idea the king arrived. A large mound between Chotusitz and the Zirkwitz pond blocked their view. Still, Frederick felt he would not be able to properly deploy his army in time. As such, he ordered the artillery to fire at the Austrian positions. As the artillery fired, Buddenbrock received orders to charge against the Austrians and hamper their advance. The Prussian right charged straight towards the Austrian left flank. Baczany ordered his cavalry to launch a countercharge. Both bodies of cavalry heavily damaged each other upon impact. An aggressive and cluttered melee ensued. According to some eyewitness accounts, rising dust blinded the rearguard of the cavalry. The Prussian cavalry, inferior to the Austrians, endured the brunt of the damage. All the while, Frederick was still frantically deploying his army in the back.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I for a second there I thought this guy was gonna have to fight Austria alone, but luckily Frederick did arrive, though he does seem to be scrambling and trying to quickly assemble. It seems so far that, at least in terms of the cavalry department, that the Austrians so far have the advantage, at least more than the Prussians. So that seems to be a pretty big advantage, though, they have. Though I think in terms of infantry and just the well-drilled of the Prussian infantry, they seem to have that much better so far.
He learned from Mollwitz that his incredibly disciplined infantry could once again make the difference in the face of adversity. Soon after, Wenzel's cavalry launched a charge against Waldorf. Fighting took place on both the eastern and western sides of the battlefield. Among all this chaos, Charles's infantry marched forward towards Chotusitz. Under Dessau, the Prussian infantry launched a countercharge as Frederick's infantry was still not ready for combat. Because the Austrian infantry had already advanced quite a bit, it did not take long for Dessau's infantry to charge into them. Heavily outnumbered, ferocious fighting broke out. Dessau's troops were slowly pushed back into Chotusitz, and when the Austrians reached the outer row of wooden houses, they lit them on fire. The smoke made commanding the armies incredibly challenging.
Oh boy.
As fighting ensued on every front, part of Waldorf's cavalry broke from the melee and charged into the Austrian right flank. Infantry fired volleys at each other as the cavalry battled it out.
Yeah, that's such an epic scene, though. Like, they're literally fighting in a burning, like, town right now. And, again, it's just the numerical superiority. Obviously, the Prussian infantry, I think, so far seems to be better. But it's just the numbers game is catching up. And, again, the cavalry so far seems to be more in line with the Austrians, so it's like Frederick is probably gonna have to move quicker because I don't think they're holding out in the long run.
Finally, Bacciani and Buddenbrook's cavalry drifted off to the Austrian left, leaving that infantry flank entirely exposed. It wasn't until 10:30 a.m. that Frederick finished deploying his infantry in a square. The fight had been going on for well over 3 hours at this point. Sources conflict, but Frederick's army numbered between 14 and 24 battalions. He managed to deploy them all without the Austrians realizing a large infantry body hid behind the mound. Upon Frederick's command, the infantry square marched forward towards the Austrian left.
Heck yeah.
The Austrian infantry was incredibly surprised to suddenly see a massive body of infantry march over the mound in a disciplined formation, moving like a wall. Flanking them entirely, they rapidly fired their volleys against the bewildered infantry.
Yeah, they have the advantage. This was really kind of an element of surprise in a sense, you know. While the fighting has been going on, I imagine exhaustion was probably starting to set in. Meanwhile, Frederick's, fresh infantry is now, like, joining the battle fresh and ready to relieve his, his forces. So overall, just like really great. Thank goodness they held out though for long,
For too long, part of the Austrian infantry began showing cracks. With an unguarded flank and facing fierce resistance from the infantry within Chotusitz, Charles decided the conditions weren't in his favor. Battling continued between both forces and there wasn't necessarily a side which gained the upper hand, but by the end of the morning, Charles ordered the general retreat. The Austrians managed to take most of their equipment with them, aside from a few heavy artillery pieces. Several officers reportedly urged Frederick to order a pursuit. However, he refused, considering his cavalry was still in disarray from the fighting, and Wenzel's cavalry guarded the Austrian rear. As the Austrians retreated, it slowly became clear to the Prussians they had won the battle. In total, Prussia suffered 4,800 casualties, whereas Austria suffered 6,400, of whom many, if not most, were prisoners. Because Charles was allowed an orderly retreat, the Battle of Chotusitz did not prove to be a decisive victory for Prussia. Although not militarily, because international developments would soon radically play into Frederick's favor. Despite not being a decisive victor, Austria's retreat certainly allowed Frederick to boast of his victory. Letters to friends reveal he exaggerated the numbers, stating the Prussians lost 1,200 at best, whereas the Austrians lost up to 7 times as many men. Charles managed to coordinate a stable retreat, whereas he was able to take up arms against Frederick again in Vienna, where he got the best of Maria Theresa and her advisors, not to mention the empty treasury. If the Habsburgs wanted to defeat France, they could not have that pesky Frederick taking up resources. As such, they finally caved to another round of diplomatic talks with Frederick. The British presided over the peace talks, agreeing to pay a significant sum for Maria Theresa to cede Silesia. The British had no interest in the balance of power on the European mainland being upset. On June 11th, both parties signed the preliminary peace at Breslau. The final treaty was signed on July 28th in Berlin. The Austrians were only willing to cede Silesia if Frederick became its sovereign duke. The king reportedly replied, "I don't give a fuck about titles, as long as I get the territory."
Oh, that's baller. Alright, so I'm really liking Frederick. Like, I don't know, he has like a really big personality. He's really in it for himself, I think, and just overall ain't afraid to speak his mind. Overall, like I'm really liking Frederick as I'm getting to know him a bit more. And again, like he's really taking advantage of the chaos. It does help that Austria is kind of already in a weak position off the get-go, and again, they're basically fighting multiple enemies, especially another great power in France. So I feel like Frederick is lucky enough to kind of, you know, he really does seize on this opportunity, I think, in the midst of all this chaos to really help himself, like, you know, elevate himself. And overall, yeah, some embellishment though there with exaggerating the numbers, but then again, that's kind of part of the course. I think we've seen a lot of military commanders kind of somewhat overinflate their accomplishments with numbers. I think so. Yeah, again, nothing different there, but it is always funny to see, I think.
Now left his former allies, the French, Bavarians, and Saxons, to fight against the Habsburgs without him. His sudden withdrawal from the war was again a massive blow to his former allies. It was the second time he betrayed them in a very short period. Despite the peace treaty, neither side expected the peace to last indefinitely. Maria Theresa knew that she would have her vengeance once she beat the French. And
I will say though, Frederick is kind of like creating a pretty, I don't think it's a good reputation to have for yourself, that like you're willy-nilly about betraying people. Yeah, I don't think it's a good reputation to have, that you're just willing to like drop alliances and treaties and whatnot willy-nilly. It does kind of create an untrustworthy, you know, situation. And obviously Austria only conceded to the peace because they were already kind of getting screwed over by all the other situations. But, you know, I imagine if you're facing a stronger power, they probably wouldn't. Then again, we do know eventually Frederick does fight a coalition, so that probably might, I'm wondering if that's an aspect to it, like he kind of built a untrustworthy reputation off the bat, but I don't know.
Frederick understood this all too well, and as soon as the peace was signed, he began restocking his depleted treasury and rebuilding his army. All the while he strengthened his new fortresses in Silesia against a possible invasion. On the early morning of June 4th, 1745, Prince Charles of Lorraine and his 63,000-strong Habsburg army camped between the cities of Pilgrimshain, Huntersdorf, and Thomaswaldau. He knew the Prussian army, commanded personally by Frederick the Great, was close by. He was in hostile territory, after all. Then, amidst the darkness of the night, he heard screams, muskets firing, and general sounds of battle. Moments later, an out-of-breath infantry soldier ran into the Austrian camp. He shouted, "The Prussians are here. They are attacking our Saxon allies nearby Pilgrimshain." Charles began shouting orders at his men, for before he knew it, the battle had already broken out. In June 1742, Austria and Prussia concluded the Treaty of Breslau. Subsequently, Frederick remained an outside observer to the fighting for 24 months. He didn't idle during this time. He continued restocking his depleted treasury and rebuilding his army, making several military improvements. 2 months after Breslau, the British envoy reported that the king is augmenting his army every day. One of the main improvements was the retraining of Prussian hussars and the heavy cavalry. Because during the First Silesian War, it became painfully obvious this Prussian cavalry performed subpar compared to the well-disciplined infantry. So already after the Battle of Mollwitz, the first battle of that war, Frederick launched a grueling training regimen, which he continued after Breslau. From now on, his hussars weren't used as heavy cavalry anymore. Instead, they performed light cavalry, scouting, and acting as flexible units. Additionally, the Prussian artillery received training to make them faster on the battlefield. Frederick's zealous improvements of his army proved necessary, despite it formerly being peacetime. By late 1742, the Habsburgs managed—
Yeah, that's good. It's good to see that he's still being proactive even in times of peace and not letting, like, peace defeat him in a sense, or becoming idle, because at the end of the day, he is still, despite there being peace, he's in quite the predicament, because I think he even knows that, like, yeah, him and Austria are gonna go at it in the future. Like, this isn't lasting, and also any potential future enemies due to his previous diplomatic shenanigans. So it's good that he's being proactive and that he's taking a big thing, because, like, the infantry game is great. Like, he's got the infantry down so far, but it really is the cavalry that was kind of, like, not performing up to par last few battles. So it's kind of cool to see what kind of improvements they make and how that comes into play in actual battle, you know?
to expel the French from Bohemia. They also occupied Bavaria, beginning a process of incorporating the electorate into the Habsburg Empire. The new year didn't bode well either. The British expanded their financial support to the Habsburgs to actual military aid. George II personally commanded his pragmatic army, scoring a victory against the French at Dettingen. During these months, the Saxons realized they gained nothing by continuing their alliance with France and Bavaria. So instead, in December, they switched sides and joined the Habsburgs. This defection was not in the least caused by Frederick's unfriendly attitude towards his allies, which he often badmouthed in public for anyone to hear. Formerly, the Saxon-Austrian alliance was defensive.
I love how he doesn't care about endearing himself to anybody at this point. Like, at the beginning, he was, like, making political moves to, like, kind of ingratiate himself and make himself seem, like, more likable, like, to put himself in a favorable position. But he seemed to have dropped that pretext and is just doing whatever the heck he wants and doesn't care anymore. He'll badmouth anyone, betray treaties and whatnot. So overall, Frederick is in his I don't care mode. He's just doing whatever he wants, and I kind of respect that, actually. I just like that. You know, and he has the skill to back it up, as we'll see in the future, I'm sure.
But everyone knew it was directed directly against Prussia. Moreover, losing Saxony as an ally posed another geopolitical problem for Prussia. Saxony's elector doubled as the King of Poland-Lithuania. He could now agree to Russian armies trekking through the Commonwealth to invade Prussia from the east. In February 1744, Frederick learned of a secret alliance signed between Austria, Great Britain, and Sardinia. Despite him not knowing for sure, he rightly assumed it was directed against him. Similarly to the First Silesian War, he felt cornered and decided not to wait for his enemies to strike first.
Yeah, that's smart. Take the initiative. And yeah, again, like, the thing is with Prussia, I feel like it's just like, you know, its place in terms of the geography of Europe is really vulnerable. You know what I mean? Like, right here, like, they're kind of like, the taking of Silesia is what is responsible for making Prussia a great power, but that's like such a, you know, precarious situation, because if you lose that, you're kind of reduced back to being weak, and you know, like I said, like look at the setting here, kind of in the center of this. Losing the Polish support is bad. Russia already disliking you from the east. Hungary right here, like now Great Britain and its naval power, like that is a really bad situation, you know. Yeah, Prussia's setting usually wasn't always the most favorable, I feel.
He signed a renewed offensive alliance with France. His goal was to conquer Bohemia, strengthen the Bavarian Holy Roman Emperor, and seize territories up to the Pardubitz for himself while he was at it. Then in August, he marched south together with 80,000 soldiers, a fully stocked war chest, and ample wagons to supply his soldiers. Most of Austria's troops were fighting the French near the Rhine. The poorly garrisoned province didn't stand a chance against the high morale Prussians. Within a week, they captured the city of Prague. 1 week later, they captured Tabor. But despite having momentum, things went wrong. In Frederick's History of My Own Times, he wrote, "No general committed more faults than I did during this campaign." News of the Prussian invasion reached Charles of Lorraine. Contrary to Frederick's expectations, Charles turned his entire army around and returned to Bohemia, with, as Blanding puts it, a speed usually thought to be uncharacteristic of the Austrians. Count Baciani had already been roaming around in Bohemia, augmenting Charles's army.
So it seems like they're gonna get the drop on Frederick once again. And I'll say, though, I do like the aspect of Frederick just admitting, yeah, you know, I kind of messed up. I do respect that he acknowledges that and is willing to learn from his mistakes. I feel like that's such a good trait to have, especially in this kind of situation, you know?
With another 18,000 soldiers. Additionally, another 20,000 Saxons joined in late October. Suddenly, Frederick faced an army of impressive size, nearly matching his own. Not willing to face the Prussians in open battle, a prolonged campaign of recapturing minor Bohemian settlements followed. This continued until December, when Frederick abandoned Prague and prepared for his winter stay in Silesia. The minor skirmishes and constant harassment of supply lines resulted in a war of attrition Frederick's army wasn't prepared for. Letters from Austrian officers reveal up to 30,000 Prussians deserted by the end of 1744.
Wow.
This included officers. They hadn't even fought a real major battle yet, and Frederick's army was already crumbling. A renewed anti-Prussian alliance, the expansion of the Saxon army, and the death of Holy Roman Emperor Charles VII unnerved Frederick even more. Charles's son and heir Maximilian III Joseph opened negotiations with Maria Theresa. After a subsequent disaster...
Yeah, that was a complete disaster. Overall, yeah, Frederick came in with all the momentum and basically lost it all. And oh, that's such a huge L though for him.
Defeat for the Bavarians at Pfaffenhofen, the Peace of Füssen, marked the end of hostilities between Bavaria and Austria. And things got even worse. Despite the alliance with France still standing, by spring 1745, the kingdom had withdrawn close to all their soldiers to wage war in the Low Countries. Unbeknownst to Frederick, behind his back, the great powers were already discussing the partition of Prussia. They wanted to eradicate the minor player, which they deemed already destroyed. All required was a finishing blow to tip it over the edge. But regardless of his desperate position, Frederick clung on. He left Potsdam for Silesia in March, determined to rebuild his army through recruitment and amnesty for deserters. In the Austrian camp, spirits were high. The Austrians decided to march into Silesia and strike the inevitable final blow against a faltering Prussia. By May, Charles already reached villages a bit to the southwest of Breslau. Augmented by 19,000 Saxon soldiers, he continued his march north. The initial invasion through the mountain passes was straightforward without any notable resistance. However, the Austrians were unaware this was Frederick's plan.
Ooh. Okay, that's cool. And again, yeah, like I said, Prussia is such in a bad position, and like, again, talks of just straight up partitioning it already had, like, Frederick basically has everything to lose, right? His entire, kingdom could just straight up stop existing. So it's cool to see that he's the underdog in all respects, you know, and just knowing that he inevitably overcomes these great challenges is just really cool to see, I think.
A Russian spy in the Austrian camp informed Charles that Frederick retreated to Breslau for a last stand. But on the contrary, Frederick aimed to lure the Austrians into the Silesian plains for open battle. As soon as they entered Silesia, things changed. Charles referred to Silesia as the most difficult country he ever had to deal with. Frederick quartered his army at a small village on a 2-hour march away from Hohenfriedberg, providing significant oversight of the Silesian plains. Austrian correspondence reveals Charles expected to meet 40,000 battered Prussians at best. Instead, nearly 60,000 awaited him. On June 3rd, Frederick received intelligence of the Austrian army marching in the plains south of his position. He ordered his men to leave the campfires burning and tents pitched, deceiving the Austrian scouts. Then they embarked on a night's march towards the Austrians. That evening, the Austrian army camped in a long line spanning from the town of
Yeah, that's overall really just smart, using the campfires to trick the enemies. It's cool to see Frederick just using more wit here to try to catch his enemy off guard.
Pilgrimshain to the Strichau Lake. In contrast, the Prussians could not form battle lines in the cluttered terrain south of the Striegau. So first they used a few bridges around the Striegau to cross the river. Crossing the bridges for an army this size took quite some time. The first to cross was Lieutenant General Dumoulin, tasked with seizing the elevations in front of the Striegau. His force numbered some 6 battalions of infantry and 28 hussar squadrons. Frederick commanded the entire Prussian army himself. Sources conflict on whether he ordered not to take any prisoners preceding the battle. Prince Charles of Lorraine commanded the Habsburg army, with Johann Adolf II, Duke of Saxe-Weissenfels, commanding the Saxons. Prussia fielded approximately 42,000 infantry, 14,500 heavy cavalry, 2,300 light cavalry, and 192 artillery guns. Light infantry and the characteristic mitre-wearing grenadiers manned the infantry lines, whereas the cavalry consisted of cuirassiers, dragoons, and hussars. The Austrians numbered some 40,000 and the Saxons up to 19,000 troops with 122 artillery pieces. The Austrian cavalry consisted of heavy cuirassiers and light Hungarian hussars. Its infantry consisted of the traditional light infantry and grenadiers. Among them walked regional regiments levied from other areas of the empire, such as the Croatian Pandurs. The Battle of Hohenfriedberg enjoyed a somewhat confusing start. Unbeknownst to Frederick, only the center of the Austrian army had lit their campfires. The Saxons and Austrian cavalry were roaming in the dark. Dumoulin soon discovered that some Saxons had already occupied the elevations. When he arrived, skirmishes broke out. And when news reached Frederick, Dumoulin was already fighting soldiers on the hilltops. He ordered 6 24-pounder guns to move onto the hill to support Dumoulin. On the other side of the battlefield, the noise of battle alerted the Saxon and Austrian lines of the Prussian advance. In response, the Saxon and Austrian commanders began deploying parts of their army. Catching on and realizing he was losing his advantage, Dumoulin decided to bypass the hills and charge straight at the Saxon camp. However, because of the scattered nature of the Austrian and Saxon lines, most of his cavalry found themselves engaged in skirmishes before reaching the Saxon camp. In addition, the Saxon cavalry was deployed further to the west and in front of Pilgrimshain than the Prussians anticipated. The Prussians would be stuck in a pincer movement if things went wrong. Fortunately for Frederick, the Prussians maintained the upper hand against the unprepared Saxons. Before too long, Dumoulin managed to launch a charge against the main Saxon encampment. Weissenfels managed to deploy part of his cavalry and launch a counterattack against the Prussians, but to no avail. As the battle continued, parts of the Saxon infantry managed to deploy and face the Prussians, but they were outnumbered. Their position wasn't strong enough to take on the ever-advancing Prussian infantry and cavalry. Scattered, ferocious fighting continued as the Prussians captured many Saxons, including their generals. Meanwhile, in the background, the Prussian infantry under Prince Leopold Max of Anhalt-Dessau was finally wrapping up their deployment in the center of the improvised battle line. They began their advance against the Saxon and Austrian line. They did not mind the sporadic bombardment of the Austrian artillery. The Prussian right, facing whatever the Saxons could deploy, met combat first, but they soon littered the battlefield with blood and corpses as they fired their volleys.
I'll say though, so far, they still seem to have the momentum of the surprise, I think. Like, granted, there was some resistance here that even Frederick couldn't have predicted, such as already the Saxons occupying the hills and some of their resistance. But overall, it does seem that the advantage of just the surprise is still working in favor of Frederick, as, he's occupying these positions and still making really good headway. So yeah, overall he still seems to have the momentum,
As battle continued, meanwhile, disaster struck the Prussian rear. Most of the army had crossed the bridges, but before a significant portion of the cavalry crossed, the bridge collapsed. As such, part of the cavalry was left behind the river. It was up to General von Zieten to find a crossing somewhere along the Striga River. This wasn't communicated to the cavalry in the vanguard, however. By 7 a.m., Prussia largely defeated the Saxons. They were not able to resist the Prussian advance on nearly every angle of their front line. Those who survived fled the battlefield. The Austrians were left alone, but they had been deploying and were now ready for battle, albeit too late to help their allies. The Austrian infantry was positioned between Guntersdorf and Thomaswaldau, while the cavalry was positioned between Thomaswaldau and the Strichau River. The Prussian vanguard cavalry contingent was the first to face an Austrian charge on their left.
Oh boy, but they're so outnumbered, at least on this point right here. Oh boy. Again, that was just bad luck there. Hopefully the Prussian cavalry contingent can just straight up get there and find another way super quick. Because look at these odds, dude. They look awful.
Weren't aware of the bridge in their rear collapsing and the lack of cavalry reinforcements. A ferocious, savage battle ensued. The Prussians were put on the back foot by the numerically superior Austrians. Things did not look good until Zieten managed to find a ford and cross the river. The sudden arrival of more Prussian cavalry shocked the Austrians. Fierce combat ensued, while another cavalry contingent crossed the same ford in the background. These arrived just in time to charge against the Austrian.
Okay, that's awesome. So, thank goodness they made it. Bad luck, but also great luck there. And so far, yeah, the Austrians, while the Saxons were completely demolished by the surprise attack, so far the Austrians at least somewhat are putting up a fight. But I think that this will overall be a success so far. And I'm kind of looking forward to seeing just how the cavalry of the Prussians do, because in the past, Austria usually got the better of them pretty quickly and easily. So I guess we'll see if the training has paid off.
Cavalry reinforcements which were charging against the Prussian vanguard. During this cavalry fight, the first Prussian infantry contingents advanced between Thomaswaldau and Guntersdorf. A report from the Prussian General Staff details: "It is flags flying and drums beating. It is Austrian canister shot and musket fire. It is an awesome, inexorable body of marching Prussians who refuse to disintegrate. Then it is assault by bayonet. The enemy falls back, the villages are seized. The king lowers his spyglass. The battle is won," he states. But they didn't win the battle just yet. As the infantry captured Thomaswaldau, they began firing at the Austrian cavalry from the west, succumbing to the overwhelming numbers and chaos a disorderly rout followed. Charles's army remained, however. Approximately 20,000 Austrian infantry held the fields between Güntersdorf and Thomaswalda. The Prussian infantry moved against them like a moving wall. The Austrians bitterly contested the ground, giving rise to a terrible fire, not lasting as long as Mollwitz, but being much noisier. They appeared unstoppable. The elite Bayreuth Dragoon Regiment filled the gaps as reserves among the Prussian infantry. They would prove crucial in Prussia's victory. It is unclear how their charge materialized, but not having seen any action, the Dragoons were looking for combat. At around 8:15 a.m. they received the order to charge against the Austrians. The Dragoons rushed between the Prussian gaps straight into the Austrian front line. They inflicted significant damage against the already battered Austrian lines. Within 20 minutes they captured 2,500 prisoners, 67 colors, and 5 artillery pieces.
Ooh.
When the smoke lifted, the troopers were seen to be hewing into a mass of fleeing Austrians. The charge was the final nail in the Austrian coffin. By 9 a.m., the battle ended as Charles ordered the general retreat. Frederick did not commit to pursuing the Austrians despite the incredible success, allowing them to withdraw to Bohemia without harassment. All that remained was a field of ghastly carnage, thousands of dead and dying men and horses. Days later, it became clear the total number of casualties on the Austrian side was close to 13,800, of whom 5,000 prisoners and 3,120 dead. As for Austrian generals, 4 were killed, 4 captured and 6 mortally wounded. The Prussians suffered 4,751 casualties at best.
Man, this is so far like Frederick's first like really like overwhelming victory. Like this was just like great, you know. And again, his trickery, him managing to catch his enemies unawares, and despite the setbacks, the fact that they were able to overcome those challenges is just amazing, and that he inflicted this. Already you're seeing like the improvement and the evolution of this guy.
It was an incredible victory for Prussia and Frederick personally.
It really was.
In the aftermath of the battle, Frederick sent letters to all European courts he could think of. He was happy to share his victory with the French King Louis XV and his old mentor, the Old Dessauer. He boasted of his victory, stating it was one of the most complete of all times, the likes of which is not seen since Blenheim. This referred to the major battle fought during the War of the Spanish Succession. He exclaimed his Bayreuth dragoons were excellent, and if this were Rome, they would have statues in their honor. In contrast,
Yeah, he's really glazing himself on. He's like, man, this is the greatest thing ever. Already the greatest battle of all time. I'm joking, but yeah. To be fair, like, man, if I won a battle like that, I'd also be super glazing myself. Are you kidding me?
Charles was livid. A letter to Grand Duke Francis details his thoughts in the aftermath of the battle. The misfortune is all the more painful to me that our troops behaved like idiots. Forgive this expression, but I am furious. Frederick likely did not pursue the Austrians, convinced Maria Theresa would sue for peace after such a devastating defeat. This did not happen, however. The next few months, Charles received plenty of reinforcements from Italy and Bohemia. It appeared the war was far from over. Maria Theresa wrote letters to George II to assure him she was, in fact, not losing the war. But George got cold feet. On August 26, he concluded the Convention of Hanover with Frederick. Both parties guaranteed each other their territory. And, as was all too common during this war, both sides overlooked to inform their main allies, France and Vienna. Again, Frederick's allies were less than charmed with his conduct. But for now, Frederick enjoyed a brief respite. Finally, he could take a step back, somewhat relax, and count his chickens. However, he began counting before his chickens hatched. And in an ongoing war, that is never a good idea. They had been playing cat and mouse for months. The Prussian army under King Frederick II had been watching the Habsburg army commanded by Prince Charles of Lorraine. They recently set up camp nearby the small village of Burkersdorf. Much to Charles's surprise, the Prussians did not seize notable elevations in the region. Capitalizing on this momentary lack of defenses, Charles knew he would be able to ambush the significantly outsized Prussians. Under the cover of mist and darkness, Austrian and Saxon infantry and cavalry emerged from the dense Königreich forest. They were ready for the battle, even though their adversaries had no idea it was imminent.
Oh wow.
In the aftermath of the Battle of Hohenfriedberg, Frederick showered his army with praise. In revealing letters, he wrote, "The army, cavalry and infantry, and hussars have never so distinguished themselves, and how everyone and his brothers fought like lions for their country." He was also optimistic about the results from Hohenfriedberg. To his ministers, he wrote that the victory will bring us good peace and a long rest. He would soon find out that was far from the truth. But he did have a good reason to think Maria Theresa wanted to sue for peace. The Habsburgs suffered defeats in Italy and Flanders. Their allies were growing tired of the war. Meanwhile, Frederick began capitalizing on his success somewhat by advancing onto Königgrätz. The Austrians and Saxons retreated to the city south to a solid defensive position. When Frederick set up camp to the north, both encampments could keep an eye on each other. But both Frederick and Prince Charles of Lorraine kept it at that and did not engage in any battle. Over summer, Frederick feigned some movements to unnerve Charles, while some generals rooted out the Hungarian hussars behind their lines in Silesia. But being this far south, Frederick's supply lines were stretched. Still, he considered himself an observation army, keeping the Austrians at bay. Throughout the weeks encamped there, he had to send off multiple detachments of soldiers to deal with small Austrian vanguard raiding parties to his north and to his west. The majority of his army, albeit slinking, remained dormant. Prince Ferdinand of Brunswick's letters reveal what he thought of Austria's strategy. "They have wounded 2 of our people with their muskets while hiding like thieves and robbers behind trees and not showing themselves in the open, as becomes proper soldiers." British attempts to broker peace weren't fruitful. They wanted the war on the European mainland to end, but Maria Theresa was livid after the defeat at Hohenfriedberg.
I do love the aspect of just this rivalry between Maria and, Frederick. I don't know, I find it like such a interesting back and forth, as they're both like really, like I said, I really like Maria. I think she came into power in a bad time, and she held it together. She held Austria together for the most part. Like, I really like her, but I'm also really liking Frederick, so it's not like I'm, rooting for one or the other. And yeah, again, like, this is just, I think, a really great rivalry and a really back and forth. And yeah, she's not completely wrong. Like, Silesia was straight up just taken from Frederick. He just stole it, in a sense. So, she's not completely wrong to be as upset about the whole situation as she's been. And, yeah, again, it's just interesting.
He sent Khevenhüller on a diplomatic mission to convince Duke Weissenfels to continue the fight against Prussia. Defeating Prussia remained the top priority. To augment the weakened Austrian army in Bohemia, Maria Theresa sent many reinforcements to Charles: 10 battalions of infantry, a corps of cavalry, and 2 senior commanders. Thanks to these reinforcements, Charles's army soon numbered over 40,000 again. In contrast, Frederick continued sending detachments of soldiers to other regions where reinforcements were required. His main force was slinking fast. By late July, Frederick decided to move. He set up his camp north of the small village of Burkersdorf. Considering himself just an observation army, perhaps that's how he lulled himself into a false sense of security.
Yeah, it seems like Frederick thinks that, it seems like the Austrians might get the drop on Frederick for a bit here, only because Frederick thinks he's so confident that after that great victory he just had, that he can kind of take a breather and rest. Which, meanwhile, Austria's mobilizing even more. And I am surprised by the Austrians' manpower reserves. They seem to have a bit more, considering that they've been fighting multiple fronts and whatnot. And I'm wondering how much manpower Prussia has, because there's never been mention about the manpower reserves of Prussia, and if it's great or low. So yeah, I'm wondering if he could even afford a long, prolonged war, you know?
Letters reveal the king was already planning to return to Berlin in winter to oversee the continued construction of his palace, Sanssouci. But
Sansuki.
international developments hinted at Maria Theresa not being eager to give up the fight, especially because her husband had recently been crowned Holy Roman Emperor. And Charles too had different plans. First, he followed Frederick and set up camp close by, overlooking Burgersdorf and the Prussian camp from a hilltop. Then, after some hesitation, he decided his position was perfect for an ambush. The dense Königreich forest provided cover, while the hills ensured they would have the higher ground. On a foggy and damp early morning, September 30th, 1745, Charles and his army marched through the hilly Königreich forest to reach the flank of the encamped Prussians. He noticed the Prussians had not captured the Granerkoppe Hill, the dominant terrain feature in the region. That night, several Saxon and Austrian vanguard units took up their positions on the hills overseeing Burgersdorf and the Prussian camp. Then, in the early morning hours, the Saxons and the Austrians emerged from the thick woodlands. On the Granerkoppe, Charles positioned 10 battalions of musketeers, 15 companies of grenadiers, 30 squadrons of cuirassiers and dragoons, 15 companies of elite carabiniers and mounted grenadiers, and 16 heavy guns pointed at the Prussians. It was a significant force for sure, but even more soldiers of the main army were positioned to the south of them. As the first Austrians emerged from the woodlands, Prussian guards called on and rushed to headquarters to inform Frederick. As Frederick was holding the 5 a.m. meeting with his generals, he received the news of Charles's army approaching. Frederick immediately jumped on his horse and rode past his army encampment, ordering the drummers and trumpets to sound the alarm. Thoroughly drilled, the Prussian infantry and cavalry rapidly took their positions. Letters from the French envoy after the battle reveal he was surprised at each regiment's speed, discipline, and initiative to take their positions without receiving specific order.
Man, that's what you call a fine, well-drilled army. And again, while I did just mention that I've never really heard much about the Prussian manpower reserves, one thing you always hear about Prussia is just their military discipline and, how well drilled they are. And I think a lot of that has to do with Frederick, that reputation that precedes even far after. So yeah, overall, it's interesting to see that the Austrians, it is kind of a cool reversal, because last battle we saw Frederick get the drop on the Austrians and just how they floundered completely, and how they weren't able to fully mobilize. Meanwhile, we're seeing the complete reverse and flipping of the situation, where the Austrians now have the opportunity to get the drop on Frederick. And just how much of a night and day difference it is, as the Prussians are just like, okay, we're ready for battle now, essentially negating their, almost negating their complete, surprise. So yeah.
Despite this, the Austrian army numbered nearly twice as many soldiers, 40,200, against Prussia's 22,000. Still, the outnumbered Prussians managed to deploy parallel to the Austrians. Frederick didn't have much time to form his plans, but his rough sketch was as follows. He wanted his cavalry on the right to circle the Granerkoppe and flank the Austrians and Saxons on the hill. Meanwhile, the infantry would attack straight against the units on the Granerkoppe. The remainder of the army had to keep the rest of the Austrians and Saxons at bay without engaging in combat. By 8 a.m., the mist mostly dissolved, upon which the Austrian artillery...
Yeah, so he did mention earlier that this area specifically was a key defining feature of the land. So Frederick wanting to immediately seize it, I can see the logic there. And yeah, he wants his cavalry to pull off the oldest trick in the book, a flank, but does he notice that there's a bunch of cavalry reserves here that would immediately counter check this charge? Because he didn't mention that.
Kuppe opened their fire. Simultaneously, Frederick gave the general order to his army to advance against the Austrian positions. The cavalry on the right faced the brunt of the damage. They were the vanguard after all. The artillery scored some significant hits against them, but they managed to push through and emerge on the Austrian left flank. A letter written by a Prussian officer reveals, "Our cavalry withstood this ordeal with composure that was all the more admirable when you consider that the enemy bombs frequently landed in the middle of the squadrons, carrying away 8 or 10 horses at once. After every explosion, the troopers collected themselves, filled the gaps, and continued their march with swords in hand. Circumventing the mound, the Prussian squadrons reached a narrow passage leading to an access point of the Kuppe. The surprised Austrian cavalry protecting the left did not launch a charge, as they remained stationary. The stationary Austrians suffered the brunt of the charging Prussian cavalry."
Oh wow, so what goes around comes around. Kind of reminds me of the first battle where the Austrian cavalry took the initiative and they basically overran the stationary Prussian cavalry. Now it seems like the reverse of the situation. This battle does seem like a reverse of some earlier situations we've seen, you know? And yeah.
Cavalry. Confused fighting followed, but the Austrians ended up being pushed back into the forest. Seeing their cavalry in disarray, several Austrian infantry units opened fire and localized melees broke out between the infantry and the cavalry. All the while, the Prussian infantry marched on. On the Prussian right, the Anhalt Grenadier Regiment, marching directly against the Kuppe, reached the foot of the hill and began climbing it. They were met with extreme resistance, both by artillery and musket fire. Without inflicting any damage against the Austrians, many Prussians fell. Among the casualties was Prince Albert of Brunswick, Frederick's brother-in-law. The Austrians cried out, "Es lebe Maria Theresa!" They caused mounting deaths among the grenadiers. Their first attack was repelled, with some units losing up to 3/4 of their men. The second attack was more successful. This time, the Geist Grenadier Regiment and 2 regiments of musketeers tried scaling the hill. Thanks to poor positioning by the Austrians on the slope, the artillery was unable to fire at the Prussians. Brief but savage fighting ensued on top of the hill before the Prussians drove the Austrians from it. The Prussian infantry and cavalry holding the other side of Burkersdorf received explicit orders not to engage the Austrians. Instead, they were to remain steady and prevent the Austrian right flank from running to support the left. But as the battle progressed, on the Prussian right, the left slowly began moving onto the Austrian lines. It is unknown why they advanced, although it is for certain this was contrary to their official orders.
Okay, so they're just going AWOL. I'm not sure if this will work out in their favor or not, because right here so far things seem to be going pretty well. Their second charge here on the hill being successful. The cavalry also was pretty successful, so the plan seems to be going pretty well on the Prussians' right. Though I guess we'll see if this ultimately ends up being a good thing that they disobeyed orders or a bad thing. In history, sometimes disobeyed orders actually work out well, but we'll see.
Led by Prince Ferdinand of Brunswick, the Prussians engaged in skirmishes. As time progressed, these skirmishes evolved into a full charge by the Prussian left. The frontal charge against the Austrian infantry led to savage, fierce combat with the cavalry. The Austrian cavalry remained stationary and did not support their infantry through all this. Their lack of initiative allowed the Prussian cavalry to seize 850 Austrian.
Yeah, this cavalry contingent seems like it could have easily fallen on a flank of the Prussians here, but it seems like they lack the initiative that they originally had, huh? As they've just remained completely stationary this battle for some reason. Yeah, they essentially let the Prussians take all the initiative.
Prisoners. Meanwhile, in the background, disaster struck the Prussians, but not in the way they might have expected. Because as the fighting continued on every front, a few Hungarian hussars and Croatian pandours did not feel like fighting. General Nadashdy and Colonel Baron von Trenck led their men straight towards the Prussian camp behind the Prussian lines. The lack of able defenders made it easy pickings. They easily killed the few defenders remaining at the camp, and then they ransacked it. They came across Frederick's tent and the war chest.
Oh no.
Reportedly, the war chest was filled with up to 80,000.
Yeah, I forgot. Frederick brought his war chest with him for this. Oh, dude, that sucks. He's gonna be broke now.
But they stole all valuables they could find and carry, seizing over 1 million ducats worth of items and belongings. Among the loot was anything from table silver to linen cloth.
Dude, they really robbed this dude. Dang, what goes around comes around, right? It's like, hey, you robbed us of Silesia, we're gonna rob you of this. You know? Oh, that's just karma right there.
Snuff boxes to even Frederick's flutes and his dog.
Oh, not the dog. Oh, that's too far, dude. You don't take a man's dog. Like, I was cool with all that, but now taking a man's dog, that's too much. I think they pushed it way too far now. I think I'm on Frederick's side now just for that. Oh, man. I'm sad. Last August, my dog died. My Doberman, her name was Xena. I'm still not over it. Like, actually, you guys can't see it, but on the wall in front of me, I have a picture of me and her, like, hung. So, yeah. Sorry, I'm a big dog guy. That caught me. I like that elicited the biggest reaction out of me. Hopefully they treated it nice, though.
Though they were plundering the camp in the background, their allies likely could have used them in the battle line instead. Because
yeah, that could have been like a perfect opportunity to perform a flank, considering they were straight up behind the enemy lines, but, you know, still, this is a pretty big FU to Frederick, though.
Because by noon, the Austrians and Saxons deteriorated into a rout into the Königreich forest. It appeared the massively outnumbered Prussians managed to fight them on both lines and emerge victorious. Despite this relatively simple battle sequence, the battle was an incredibly bloody and savagely fought affair. The casualties indeed mounted. In total, the Prussians suffered 3,911 casualties, of whom 856 died. Frederick's brother-in-law, Duke Albrecht of Brunswick, was among the dead. It is very telling of Frederick's poor marriage quality, for he did not even write his wife a letter of condolence.
Wow.
The Austrian and Saxon casualties.
Yeah, I mean, the impression Frederick's not that nice of a guy. Again, I know I don't hate him, I'm just saying, like, his personality so far, for what I'm gauging, you know, trash talker, willing to break, treaties and negotiations, if it benefits him solely, and that, like, he doesn't seem like the nicest guy. Not to say that I hate him, because we followed plenty of unnice people, like Napoleon. But yeah, he does seem like a really hard person. You know what I mean? Like, in that sense.
Casualties numbered 7,444.
Ooh, dang.
In the aftermath, Frederick tried to launch a pursuit, but the forests, hills, and lack of coordination among his troops prevented any significant follow-up. He later wrote about this. My cavalry came to a halt not far short of the enemy rearguard. I hastened up and shouted, Marsch, vorwärts, drauf. I was greeted with Vivat Victoria and a prolonged chorus of cries. Again I called out, "Marsch," and again nobody wanted to move. I lost my temper, I struck out with my stick and fist, and I swore. And I think I know how to swear when I'm angry, but I could do nothing to bring my cavalrymen one step forward. They were drunk with joy and didn't hear me. He described the battle as terrible but glorious and the fiercest of the four he had fought. He remarked it had been bloodier than Hohenfriedberg. He also recognized the shrewdness of the Austrians, complimenting Charles on his initially thought-out strategy. It was thanks to Frederick's soldiers' discipline, the thinking on his feet.
Yeah, it really is. So far, a lot of it is just the great quality of the Prussian army, which can help negate disadvantages that they had, you know? Because, like, the Austrians at certain points have had advantages. It's just, like, again, that the superior quality of Frederick, of the Prussians, just seemed to help negate that, you know?
And the courage in the face of aversion that Sohr did not become a bloodbath. Oh, and he wrote a letter to his wife after multiple complaints about his cruel behavior. It translates roughly to, "He was a brave man. I'm amazed he wasn't killed long ago." The French envoy remarked that at Hohenfriedberg he fought for Silesia, but at Sohr he fought for his life. But despite this significant success in battle so far, danger still loomed for Frederick, and it would arrive much sooner than he anticipated. It was a cold and misty early afternoon in December 1745. Light snow fell down on the Prussian army slowly approaching the small village of Kesselsdorf. They had been chasing their adversaries with great reluctance, echoed by their commander Frederick the Great's mentor, Prince Leopold I, also known as the Old Dessauer. Inside the town, Saxon Field Marshal Frederick Augustus, Count Butowski, was relatively confident awaiting the impending battle. Kesselsdorf was well fortified, his Saxons outnumbered the Prussians, and he knew an even larger army was approaching to reinforce him. Then, the Old Dessauer ordered his army forward in a ferocious frontal charge against the fortified positions, despite facing superior numbers. After the Battle of Sohr, Frederick made sure his army remained on the battlefield for a few days to show the world the Prussians were in fact victorious. Considering his army was outnumbered nearly 2-1, propaganda could quickly turn that around. All the while, Frederick received news of his generals scoring victories against irregulars behind front lines deep in Prussian territory. He also received optimistic dispatches from his envoy negotiating peace with the English. Admittedly, things were looking pretty good for the Prussians, and the king was certain peace was imminent. But it was wishful thinking. Maria Theresa was dead set on the
Yeah, she ain't letting that go, dude. Like, the moment you took Silesia, Maria basically became his number one, like, rival from there. And she just won't let it go, you know?
destruction of Prussia and the king personally. Frederick's personal account in the history of my own times reveals the fortitude of the empress degenerated sometimes into obstinacy. She was a woman intoxicated at having recovered the imperial dignity for her descendants. Occupied solely by the smiling prospects of futurity, she thought her grandeur would be degraded should she negotiate with a prince whom she accused of rebellion as with an equal. After Sohr, his supplies and army were exhausted to the degree that he marched his army back towards Silesia by early October. Frederick traveled towards Berlin while the rest of his army under the Old Dessauer crossed the border on October 19th. Despite his optimism, the war chest was running empty, and Frederick actively pursued a new loan from either France or England, whoever was willing to help. On the Austrian side, things were moving as well. The Austrians planned to augment the Saxon army at Dresden before launching a winter campaign directed against Brandenburg and perhaps Berlin. First, they planned to surprise attack the Old Dessauer, winter-quartered in Halle. Then, they would push his army back all the way to Magdeburg. Diverting from waging war in Silesia, an attack against the relatively unprotected Brandenburg and its capital could be a fatal danger for Frederick. If this assault materialized, it would circumvent Frederick's army stationed in Silesia entirely. It would be a disaster. But the Prussian king was very well informed. Upon his arrival in Potsdam, Frederick's sources among the Saxon court informed him the next Austrian attack was to launch from Saxony, directed against Brandenburg. Then news reached him from the Russian court, where the Tsarina publicly announced she would support Saxony if they faced an attack. So he rightly grew more worried. Uncharacteristic as it was for the Austrians, they once again moved fast with their plans. General Nadashti with 14,000 light infantry reached Friedland, where he set up camp. Prince Charles was moving on to Reichenberg. Frederick's scouts reported that the Austrian army had already crossed the Saxon frontier in early November. In response, Frederick dispatched his trusted Hussar commander von Zieten to hinder the Austrians from linking up with the Saxons at Dresden. Frederick himself, he departed from Potsdam and he ordered the Old Dessauer to redeploy his quartered army. Von Zieten's hussars were the first to engage in serious combat during the winter campaign. On November 23rd, one Saxon infantry regiment and 3 cavalry regiments defended Katholisch-Hennersdorf. Noticing the enemy, Zieten's hussars charged again. After brief but savage fighting, the Saxons retreated, losing over 900 soldiers. Only 9 miles away was Prince Charles's army. Its lack of supplies, poor morale, and contradictory orders by generals wasn't a good foreboding. Instead of coming to the Saxons' aid, Charles learned the Prussians outnumbered his 18,000-strong army nearly 3-1. He ordered the retreat back into Bohemia. It appeared the Austrian offensive was averted before it had ever begun.
Oh, wow.
Charles lost over 5,000 soldiers, whereas Prussia lost no more than 100. Frederick wrote, "I have done everything that a general can do with the least spilling of blood and with the greatest results." He wasn't wrong.
Yeah.
And this did not go unnoticed among the Saxons and Austrians either. Soon after the battle, they received the British envoy carrying Frederick's instructions to offer them a moderate peace. Despite the initial refusal, the Saxon ministers did open negotiations, and the prospects seemed rather promising. Still, Frederick bombarded his mentor, the Old Dessauer, with letters ordering him to fall on the Saxons. So as the negotiations were ongoing, Dessauer scored victory after victory, crushing the poorly garrisoned Leipzig and forcing the Saxon field marshal, Frederick Augustus, Count Rutowski, to fall back nearby Dresden. It has to be said that the Dessauer completed these tasks with an unhealthy dose of aversion. Surviving correspondence between Frederick and him reveal he did not shy away from giving his opinion on the forced marches and battles during midwinter. His men were tired, and he refused to carry out Frederick's orders several times. Some correspondence implied...
Dang. Yeah. In all fairness, yeah, you could kind of see why he's upset, especially while there's technically peace going on, but again, I'm looking at it through both perspectives. I think Old Dessauer definitely is making a point that, yeah, you know, all this is kind of exhausting us, and there's technically is open peace talks in a sense, but yeah.
That if things had gone differently, Dessauer would be a suitable candidate for court-martialing. But unbeknownst to both commanders, in the background, peace negotiations were ongoing and looked more optimistic by the day.
Yeah, then again, they're not fully aware of this, I suppose, so that makes sense. Of the peace.
Still, following the king's orders, Dessauer advanced onto Dresden. Finally, on December 15, both armies met near Kesselsdorf, slightly south of the capital. It was a cold and misty afternoon with light snow. The Old Dessauer and his army marched onto Dresden from the west, when scouts informed him of Field Marshal Rutowski and the Saxon main army holding the ground from Kesselsdorf to Ockerwitz. The old Prussian commander, 69 years old.
Alright guys, so I know this is a bit abrupt, but like I said, I wanted to break this series down into 7 parts, since the video in total 7 hours, 8 minutes 49 seconds. I decided each episode is gonna be 1 hour 8 minutes 49 seconds. So by the total, there should be 7 parts. I'm gonna end the video right here, my friends, and we will immediately pick up here tomorrow. So bye everyone.